It says host
Yes.
next to your name, so that should be good.
Okay, cool. Cool. This time, yes, I was able to start the recording. So officially, welcome back to another special interest group object meeting. Today is July 31st, 2024, and we are here again. So this might be the meeting that I am most unprepared for. As you can see, our meeting notes are empty, so please fill them in. I can see that we already had some items from last week from Matt, and we have some items from Christian, and I guess from Blake. Oh, okay, Blake is here as well. Okay, cool. So I am going to maybe carry these to the agenda here. And I'm going to begin with Christian. Christian, welcome. I don't think I've seen you before, so I'm giving you priority on the topics today.
Hey, thank you.
Then I'm going to put Blake, Matt, because you are the owner of the meeting, one of the owners of the meeting, I'm going to put you at the end. All right. So, Christian, would you like to talk about your issues and cases here? Feel free to share your screen.
Sure. I didn't prepare anything, but I could maybe I'll share my screen with the issue if I can. Just give me a second. Okay, one sec. There we go. Open that, and I'll open that. Okay, I'll share my screen. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes, if you could also zoom a little bit, people
Yeah.
might be.
Sure.
Yep.
Okay. So basically, we've been having issues with the Azure. Wait, I'm not on the right one. Sorry. We've been having issues with the Azure managed identity provider based on Upjet, and ever since the version 1.1, which I think includes the Upjet rework, it's been having issues with syncing resources, and we didn't have the confirmation before, but we kind of dug a little deeper, and it seems to be because of rate limiting on the Azure API. So that's our theory, but we don't have like a full confirmation. What we did recently is, well, actually, I came to a previous meeting for Upjet, and you guys recommended playing with the max reconcile rate and a few other permissions, not permissions, but parameters, sorry. And we did try that, but it didn't really help in most cases. So so we dug a little further, and we were getting the context deadline exceeded issue all the time. And checking in the code, it seems to be because of the reconcile timeout and reconcile grace period, which is in the Crossplane runtime. And these are hard coded to 1 minute and 30 seconds. So if reconcile takes more than that, it's just going to context deadline exceed and bubble up that error. But what we think is happening is that the Azure SDK under the hood, which is used by the Terraform provider, Azure RM, it seems to be handling the rate limiting by respecting the 429s and using the retry after header to do the call again and again and again until it tries to succeed. But obviously that takes more than the deadlines that were set up here and hard-coded. So the error that we're getting is just context deadline exceeded instead of actually getting the 429 error bubbling up. So it's hard for us to know if it's actually rate limiting, but that's what we think it is. So one thing we did on our side is we've created a custom provider using the Azure SDK directly. And we've also done another improvement which kind of reduces the number of external calls. But that's not necessarily related to Upjet. But I think because we did both of these improvements, we're not hitting the rate limiting anymore. And we can see, let me just zoom in a little bit more. we do see that it's like a lot faster to sync and it stays synced, whereas the other one, just a simple pod restart would drop everything and it'd take like years to like hours and hours and hours and hours just to sync back, and sometimes it never got there. So I think there's maybe an issue in the way the rate limiting is handled. I don't know where exactly that issue would be, but that seems to be what we're seeing. Yeah, and basically so there's two issues here, but like I think, as I said, the other one is not for Upjet, it's more for Crossplane runtime. But I think it's still pertinent, like it's still important, where a simple pod restart of the Upjet based provider would drop the sync rate everywhere, because it's trying to reconcile all of the objects that we have, and we have quite a bit, 4,000 here. So it's trying to reconcile all of those, and it's actually calling the external APIs. And so that's hitting the rate limiting because of that, even though it doesn't necessarily need to call the external APIs if everything was synced fairly recently, for example. So one thing we did is, that's more on the Crossplane runtime side, I put it here actually. We implemented two properties in the status of our MRs. And basically we hash the spec, and we save the last external reconcile time. So we basically check if the spec hash has changed, or if the last external reconcile has passed our configured sync time, then you can do an external call. Otherwise, just assume everything is good and skip it.
So I have two comments here. Regarding the spec hash, what happens if the external resource is updated outside, Crossplane? Let's say somebody modified the resource on the console, and the spec of the managed resource has not changed, but doesn't reflect the desired state, right?
Yeah, but that's exactly why we have the last external reconcile,
Yeah,
because we have like
yeah.
there's two parameters, right? On the providers, there's like the sync and the poll rate. My understanding is that the poll rate is to see if we've missed any Kubernetes event about changes on our resources in Kubernetes, and the sync rate is actually to check externally to see if the resource in the external provider has changed, and to reconcile that.
Yeah.
So,
and regarding recording the last reconciliation time in status is not a good idea, because it brings lots of overhead to HCD. So we have recently had a very similar discussion, like we were investigating whether it would make sense or it would be okay to record the last reconciliation time in status conditions. As you know, we have right now the last transition time, so that which marks the timestamp where a state transition has occurred. But as long as you are in that state, we don't update the timestamp. And we were considering whether it's okay to add, to update the status with each reconcile to record the time. So I think that's what we are doing here, right? So with each reconcile, we are recording the reconciliation timestamp.
Not necessarily. Actually, we just update this field only if an external reconcile happens, and so that's only gonna happen if the spec hash changed or if we've passed the synced rate. So it's actually not doing that many changes on that field. It's only saving it the first time you reconcile, and every time either the spec changes or the sync has passed for that field, for that resource, sorry.
So you don't record it with each reconcile, but whenever there's a spec change, you mean? When generation changes, or you run out of that predefined timeout or something like that?
We were basing ourselves on the fact that we're getting called automatically based on the poll rate that's configured. or if we get a Kubernetes event on a change, and we just added this logic in the observe function where we check this, and then we define if we've passed the sync period, which we had to save somewhere because it's not exposed. But anyways, and then we just if we need to resync, or if it's the first run, then we do the external reconcile, and that's when we set the last external reconcile. Otherwise, we don't set it, so it stays the same.
Okay.
So that's kind of how we did. I don't think it's maybe there's better ways to do it, probably in Crossplane runtime directly, but this is just the way we did it because we needed a quick fix.
Yeah, so you're basically using, this, what was the field name? Last external reconcile time.
Yeah.
So you have a predefined sync period. I don't know the order of it, but it's defined constant sync period, right?
Yeah.
So if there is no spec change for that period, you don't reconcile, but even if there's no spec change, in that period, and the timeout expires, which is defined by that constant, then you still do a reconcile, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we do, for example, the sync interval is really this thing that's configured on the providers. There's the sync and the poll. We just exposed that in the constant because we didn't have access to this variable in the observe function. But, yeah.
Can you explain me, all period also has a similar use, right?
Can you
so
read?
You define, sorry? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear. Sorry, it's just I have a lot of noise at my place. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. So poll period also has a similar, purpose. If there's a spec change, the managed resource will be reconciled earlier than the next poll period. But you will wait for the poll period as long as there is no spec change. But what you are doing here is, upon a pod restart, you are trying to avoid reconciliations, or let's not say reconciliations, but external polls.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Because you have recorded the timestamp of last observation, and since that much of time is not passed, let's say you'll not reconcile. But if the pod restart occurs later than that, then you will still reconcile all the resources, right?
We will not externally reconcile if that time hasn't passed, because I mean.
But let's assume it has passed. For
Yeah.
Currently, what's that time?
Sorry?
What's that constant currently?
Which one? The sync period?
Yes.
As I said, it's the one that's defined here. So for by default, it's 1 hour, for example.
Okay, it's 1 hour. Let's say the pod stays down, for longer than 1 hour, then you will still be.
Yeah, it will reconcile everything.
All the resources,
yeah,
but you have chosen it deliberately, something like 1 hour, because you don't expect, 1 hour to pass between pod restarts.
Yeah, well,
I think I understand your reason. Yeah.
For instance, in our case, we actually put it more than 1 hour because we don't expect it to change very well at all, honestly. So we put it to something like 6 hours because it doesn't really matter. We don't need to do that many external calls for the specific resource we're doing. So it's mostly an optimization to prevent calling the external APIs too much. But as I said, that's more on the Crossplane runtime side. But the issue either on the Upjet or I don't know, is more of the handling of the rate limiting itself.
Yeah, I see. You're not happy with the current rate limiting controls we have, I guess, right? So decreasing makes the reconcile rate also, throttles the reconciliations, but then you cannot get your resources ready timely, maybe, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. Yeah, exactly.
So I think I understand your problem.
It's mostly at scale because when we started using it, it was not a lot of resources and it was getting synced quite fast. But
Yeah,
as
yeah.
we've added more resources, even playing with the fields, just you can see the queue the queue depth, it never ends. It's just constant.
I
Yeah.
thought we had something at Upjet that looked at rate limited time or rate limited response codes and then did a exponential back off. Did we not add that in Upjet? I thought that was a thing that I remember hearing about, but
I don't think that is the case, Blake, because the rate limiting concerns are totally handled by either the SDK client, in which case this is going to be Azure's SDK client, or the Terraform layer, unless we specifically do something in the providers individually, and certainly we cannot do anything about this at the Upjet layer.
Yeah.
So Blake, what you sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Alper. I put some pointers, by the way, Christian and Blake, if you're interested in how we handled rate limiting concerns in the past. We have some metrics in place, Prometheus metrics in place in Upjet, and you can use those in the providers. We are indeed counting number of external API calls in provider AWS, but it requires quite knowing the intimate details of how the underlying Terraform provider work and how to expose those measured SDK client measured things to the provider. So it is not impossible, but if you would like to get involved, you can use these pointers to measure the number of API calls in the Crossplane provider layer.
I was wondering if maybe these fields would be able to be configurable instead of being hard coded. I don't know what you think about that, but because maybe extending that period would get a better chance of having a successful retry, but maybe that's not the best solution.
Yes, so Blake, I was going to say what you have seen in Upjet, the rate limiters you have seen is for rate limiting reconciled requests. So, there's the concept of worker queues in client Go, and we enqueue reconciled requests in that worker queue, and that's what we rate limit in Upjet. They are not related to, as Jem explained, the external APIs rate limiting. It's like the rate limiting that we do for enqueuing requests. And regarding these parameters, by the way, I'm a little bit confused. So we need to check it. It's configurable, but the default is the asynchronous reconciliation mode. And the managed resources reconciler is not bound, with these parameters. Let me put it that way. So, but there are some separate, timeouts defined on the Terraform side. Maybe you're observing the context deadline exceeded errors from the Terraform layer, not from the Crossplane layer. So that's my assumption. So we may need to check this. We can also reconcile the resources, in synchronous mode. In that case, what I'm saying does not hold. You are bound with those parameters, but it should not be the case. I think those errors should be coming from the Terraform layer. So maybe Terraform is retrying because it's getting a 429. So that it backs up and retries and backs up and retries, but it has a configured timeout, and probably in that timeout you cannot get the request flowing. The server side keeps rejecting the request because there have been too many requests, and then maybe we are getting the next deadline exceeded. Could be.
Okay, so I understand the complexities maybe on the Upjet side. So maybe it would be a better idea to focus on reducing the number of calls to prevent rate limiting, I guess.
Yeah, so I was going to mention, we have this pause annotation, but in order to make use of the pause annotation, you would need a separate controller. So let's say the issue that, you know, the current controls that you have in Crossplane runtime and also in Upjet are not sufficient, let's say, and you'd like to implement, you know, some other rate limiting on top of this. One of the primitives that you can make use of, you know, is the pause annotation, through which you can control, you know, which resources are being reconciled and which are paused, right? So probably, you know, this is not the easiest thing to do for you because it means that, you know, you'll be writing an external controller which manages these things. I just want to mention, you know, it's, you know, as an alternative.
If you did that, would it trigger a reconcile immediately as soon as you remove the pause annotation?
Yes. As soon as you remove or change the pause, like, you know, if you're setting pause annotation to true, resource would be reconciled, but like, you know, a reconciliation request would be queued, but it would not be reconciled because it's paused. And if you remove the annotation or set a value to false, then it would immediately reconcile the resource, making an operation and doing drift detection and necessary updating to the external resource.
Would everyone be happy if we moved forward? Christian, maybe if you further develop on the issue, you can report us in the next meeting. I would like to move on with our agenda now.
Yeah, no problem.
Just one quick question, maybe. Like,
Yep.
how hard is it, Christian, for you to even just throw a PR out to Crossplane runtime on this? I guess my thought is I'd be interested to see when there's an actual pull request, what feedback looks like on it.
Yeah, I wouldn't be against it. I mean, it's mostly, I just want to know if the people from Crossplane are interested in having that type of feature, but I could definitely look into it.
So our community policy is to ask for permission before implementing anything, just to prevent any efforts wasted. So maybe you can first open an issue and announce your intent, and the providers would be happy to give you some guidance there.
That's basically what I have though. I've opened May 22nd, so it's been there for a while.
And Christian
Okay.
actually brought this up in the last Crossplane community meeting as well. Alper, what do you think? Do you think this is something worthwhile in Crossplane runtime? You know, this is an area that you're the main expert in, and you know the likes of Nick and Jared would very much take guidance from you on this as well.
Yeah, so like, you know, I feel like, you know, this would not be the approach that would be following, you know, so you know, I don't know if you heard it, but I first thought, like, you know, this last external reconcile, the timestamp that we are trying to record was updated at each reconcile, which is certainly a no-go because we already know that it brings a lot of head on HCD. But like, you know, it's not the case in this case. Like, you know, it's updated, you know, at most each 1 hour. It's the current setting. So I feel like, you know, there will be objections to this. Did this proposal receive any you know, comments from the upstream maintainers, by the way?
Not yet.
Nope.
Not yet, right?
But as I said, the way we implemented it is not necessarily the way I would want to implement it in Crossplane runtime, but the main goal here is to just reduce the number of external calls and not, like, you know, on a pod restart of a provider, I don't think it should call the external provider. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Maybe, like, you know, what I would suggest to you is maybe you can directly attack that issue like, with attacking, I'm not proposing, that you try to come up with a solution. But what you could say, like, with a new issue, probably, the pod restart is a synchronization point where we try to reconcile, like, in your case, 4,000 managed resources, right? So for this issue, we have this, the jitter config, a jitter has been introduced, but in your case, like, so is jitter configurable on the official provider side? Jim, could you please
I
check it?
believe yes. But
Did
in
we
in
expose-
Christian's case, I believe he has more trouble, especially around this issue when the pod restarts. And during the first reconcile, I guess he's going to be rate limited regardless of the jitter.
So, if you choose a ridiculously large jitter,
Ah, okay.
so that was my idea, but I don't think it's a good solution, like, But the jitter had been introduced for similar reasons. So, when these reconciliations are synchronized for certain reasons, then, like, we introduced the jitter so that that synchronization will not cause a large number of reconciliation requests being reconciled for exactly the same time. But I don't believe also jitter is the answer to this. Like, I was just thinking, like, if we expose the jitter parameter, like, and if you choose a ridiculously large value for it, like, like 1 hour, but it's like, that was my thinking, but not my, proposal to, solve this problem. But what I would suggest is, like, we can open a new issue. We can mention, like, in pod restarts, we have these large number of reconciliations, and that causes, throttling on the, external API side. And, let's describe this issue. Maybe there is already, so I also feel like, this should have been discussed previously. Did you check for previous issues, Blake or Christian, in Crossplane runtime and reconciler?
I don't think so.
Okay, so, let's open an issue if no previous issue exists.
Okay.
So, I mean, like, this issue already says it. Maybe you can also, change it. So you have already pointed that the pod restarts, synchronizes reconciliations. Not sure if we need to move with a new issue, but, like, you'd better not propose directly a solution. You could do it, but I think it's a better idea. Like, this is not an easy problem. It's a better idea to, clearly state. I don't know. So it looks like also to me, that's also what you did.
Yeah, it's okay. I think Jean in the chat has said he's gonna try to get people to put some feedback on the issue, and then we can move forward from that. So it's all right for me. Thank you.
Yeah. So
Sounds good.
Yeah.
If we could onboard some maintainers on the Crossplane side, perhaps things are going to be better. All right, next topic is from Blake. Blake, would you like to talk about it?
Or either I can pull up the issue, or if you want to, either way is fine with me.
I bet you would be in a better position to guide it.
Sure. So one of the things I've noticed recently is CloudFront distributions, specifically on the AWS provider, don't seem to change status when they're actually deploying. And so if you're unfamiliar, right, CloudFront distributions, the way they work is you'll have the distribution, it will spin up. And then whenever you go and create a new change to it, like you, for example, change an origin path or you change a web ACL ID, that has to propagate throughout the AWS global infrastructure, right? That takes time to happen. But what seems to be the case is when you create a CloudFront distribution, specifically with the wait for deploy parameter, um, the resource will on initial creation will sit in a waiting state, waiting for Terraform to actually report and AWS to report that it's actually in a deployed status. But whenever you go to make an update to it, the app provider status, which comes from Terraform, sits in a deployed state. It never changes to a deploying state, and it automatically sets it as ready. And so I went through kind of an exercise that Matt kind of laid out of really trying to do a watch on the resource, kind of doing the update on initial creation, and looking at debug logs. And it seems like there's a misconfiguration in the way we're assuming the distribution to work on the Terraform side and what we're actually getting, I think is my assumption. The other kind of interesting thing about this resource specifically is there's a wait for deployment parameter on the distribution, and it defaults to true in Crossplane. When you set it to false, you'll see status end up looking like this, where I think specifically the interesting thing is the status here will actually move to things like in progress, deploying, deployed. So I guess I'm trying to figure out where the best place to address this is. Is this a good place to address it on the Terraform side, or is this a good place to address it in the provider side? My inclination is to think the provider side. And I don't know if, for example, there's logic within Upjet to say, I mean, I would imagine we probably want this wait for deployments not available. I don't know why in the
Blake, you're frozen.
Yeah, I guess we lost him.
I guess so, yeah. Too bad, I was enjoying it. All right, what should we do? I guess until Blake comes, we can move on to my updates regarding the to-dos I have on my plate. I was going to investigate why we have managed resource ARNs at all, because it seemed to be against XRMs. Unfortunately, I've been firefighting for the last 8 or 9 days, so I couldn't find time to look into it. But I talked to Fatih about it, so he told me that he doesn't remember exactly, but he gave me some context. He has a hypothesis that because other things were breaking, we had to include it, or just to be on the safe side because we suspected that things were going to break. But this is just an update. I'm going to find the reason for sure.
I did a little bit of archaeology
Sorry.
2 weeks ago
You
on
did that. Okay.
you saw that? Did you see that I posted on the GitHub issue of like linking to a comment that John posted back in October or something like that?
I didn't see that. I guess I missed it. If you could post the link, I would be
I'll
happy to
make
check.
sure I'll do that, and I'll make sure that I actually posted it as opposed to writing a really long draft and then it never actually getting submitted to
okay.
GitHub.
Okay. So Blake, because Blake is here, Matt, let's return to him and we can continue the discussion later. Blake, are you there?
Yeah, no, I'm here. Sorry. I think my internet
Yeah, please
ended
go
up
on.
dying on me real quick.
But I guess
yeah,
you had
essentially
made your case, right? If you want, I can give you my opinion on this.
Yeah, I'd be interested in it because I guess the
Okay.
other thing is I'm not fully aware of tools available in Upjet to make the config change on the Upjets or on like the provider side.
So I remember Matt responding to you, and his response was quite spot on. For instance, I worked on an issue in upstream Terraform regarding RDS instance creation. So what I think is going on with your resource is when you set wait for deployment to true, Terraform blocks our provider, Crossplane provider, and actively waits for the deployment process. And in the meantime, therefore, we don't reconcile I mean, we are actively waiting for Terraform to return so that we can continue our reconciliation loop. That's why we don't see any updates in the status at all. And if you set it to false, somewhat paradoxically, we will continue reconciling it and get the status updates.
Right.
So if
I
you
guess
would like,
my
yeah, please go
sorry,
on.
I guess my thought is there any reason we would ever want people? My inclination is no, it would just be crawling that out, but maybe I'm wrong on that thought.
Blake, I lost your almost all your sentences. Can you repeat them?
Sorry.
And he's gone. Okay, so until he returns, Matt, I guess you're right. Okay, you haven't. Okay, Blake is back. Blake, are you here? Okay, how about we continue so we don't waste everyone's time? Matt, do you have anything more to add other than the draft you were going to post and the link?
So I did post it. I just
You
slacked
did.
it to you. It's on the
Okay.
it's on the issue. It sort of gave a summary of the discussion from the meeting 2 weeks ago, and
Okay.
and then also provided some extra context and links to what I could find, at least from the public GitHub records.
Okay. Yeah, I remember seeing this one and reading the first introduction part of this one, but I have not arrived at the archaeology part. Okay, cool. So what's your verdict on the issue?
Inconclusive.
Inconclusive. Okay.
I think it seems like the Jean cited the use case of wanting to delete all of the inliner managed policies for a resource was the reason, like, which is sort of the use case I'm having, and that was the reason cited for why we should do this in a principled way, not just in a pragmatic way. At the time that we were doing this, we were still forking a CLI process for every Terraform CLI process for every reconciliation. There were massive performance issues, especially related to provider IAM, because you usually end up with more IAM resources than anything else. So I think there were some practical pressures for making simpler ways to have fewer managed resources. But separate from that, Jean's comment that I linked at the bottom of my post said that the alternate use case is to be able to say remove everything, including removing things that were not defined necessarily defined in Crossplane in the first place. So I think that either we need to change that decision, or we need to make fixes to this resource to make that actually work. Because currently we said that's what we're going to do, but then it doesn't work.
I see. Yeah, I'm rather against doing things. I'm rather against doing things against XRM. But of course, the practice of running and maintaining a provider is totally different. And yeah, so it looks like John's case was similar to yours. This was your case as well, right? So clearing all of the managed policies by setting it to an empty list.
Yes, right.
Okay.
It sounded like he was summarizing some discussion that was happening among some of the Upbound folks.
Yeah,
late last year.
it looked, yeah, it was last year, almost exactly August last year.
So I don't know anything about that discussion other than the summary he posted on GitHub, or who had what use case, but yeah, that the core of what that use case was the same as mine, which is that being able to detach everything.
Okay, yeah, so well, if it wasn't
feels
that,
feels super strongly about this, like if we do decide to go change that decision and just not support this, the fact that I have a few resources that are trying to use this and failing is not a big problem. So I'm more interested in approaching this from a like best long-term result perspective than a pragmatic solving a problem that I'm running into with my usage of the provider.
yeah, I see. I mean, if this was an easy feat, maybe we could have gone for it. But given that the implications might be really widespread, if we remove the omit empty, or even adding another configuration layer on
Yeah.
disabling
So-
omit empty. I mean, things are
Right, I think-
already quite messed up in configuration side. So yeah.
I think that we can't remove the learning from that I got from the last meeting was that omit empty is necessary and not removable because the Golang type is a slice of pointers to strings, not a pointer to a slice of strings, or a pointer
Yep.
to a slice of pointers to strings.
Yeah, you're right. Thanks for remembering. It is indeed not possible.
We can't remove omit empty unless we first change that type, which would be hard.
Yeah, definitely.
So
the question is whether we configure or not, right?
whether we can, I mean, I guess we could use, what would we have to do? I don't understand what configuration would even look like, because like we would have to, if we made it configurable, then the only way I can think of to implement that configuration would be to remove omit empty and change the fields type to a pointer. Which means that we have a configuration option that changes the type. That's not totally weird because everything is generated.
But it's going to be a breaking change, by the way.
At the Go API level is a breaking change, right? What?
Yeah.
The Kubernetes API level, would that be a breaking change? Why does it matter if the Go API is a breaking change, as long as there's
Good question. I'm not really familiar with Kubernetes concepts, but if it is not compatible at the Go layer, I'm afraid while reconciling, we are going to trip on our own empty implementation. Empty, when we see an empty slice there, we are not going to omit it, and we are going to behave accordingly. So that means there is no default value, right? Am I right?
Oh, I think I see what you're saying. I understand what you mean by tripping on the empty implementation.
Yeah. So if there's no default value, right, we are going to assume that it is empty, an empty string, but empty slice. Excuse me.
So what would be breaking in that case? Like, let's say we implement this per field, on empty override capability, like let's say, and we configure this for, the manage policy ARNs field, then what would break is late initialization, right? So we would no longer be including the omit empty there, and with no type change, we would be getting an empty slice, which would prevent late initialization from late initializing that field. So if any client depends on the late initialized values, any client of the API, observes manage policy ARNs after late initialization, they will no longer be observing the
We're
attached
not late
policies.
initializing this. This is a field that we're skipping late init for.
There
Largely
specific
because of this
configuration
reason.
for it. Okay.
For this resource, yeah. These fields are said to.
Yeah. So yeah, from a theoretical point of view, that would be a breaking change. But in this case, if we are skipping late initialization,
The other possibility I can think of is removing the managed policy ARNs and inline policy fields and adding separate Boolean fields for things like detach all managed policies and delete all inline policies. That it would let you declare there should be 0 managed policies. It would not let you declare there should be this list of managed policies and no others.
I have
But
an objection to
that,
Matt.
great, let's hear it.
Yeah, so let's say, so you're proposing we put a Boolean field, and in case we set that Boolean field, let's say remove all managed policies, we try to remove the managed policies from the IAM role, right? That's what you're proposing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the issue there is the IAM role managed resource should be updating only one external resource, right? So on the AWS side, we have a different external resource that represents the attachments. That's why we also have a separate managed resource corresponding to it. So I
Yes,
think,
and we have the role policy
that's
resource for inline.
Yeah,
So it's the same exact same. Yes.
That's the real issue. If you remember in the last meeting, we were discussing in the Terraform provider, they should be updating another external resource to implement that functionality, right? So it boils down to the same thing. So this is
Another
what's
external
against
resource to
XLM.
implement what functionality?
Excuse me?
There should be another external resource to implement what functionality?
To implement clearing all the attachments from a role. So in order to do that, you need to create, delete, update, you need to delete another external resource from the controller of the role managed resource. So that's what's against the XRM.
I guess
So that's also the reason
the use case,
we discuss why we should not have the managed policy ARNs field in the very first time, right?
right.
So it's the same problem, I mean. So if you're going to allow this, if you're going to allow manipulation of another external resource than the IAM role resource, then we could also just leave the XRM managed policies and so that's the real issue here.
Sorry, what are you saying is the real issue?
The real issue here is the controller of the IAM role also updating another external resource, in this case, the attachment resource.
Right.
So that's what causes races, and in order to prevent those races, the XRM disallows this. So that's the logic behind it.
That makes sense. So the the trouble comes when you couple the fact that Crossplane has no query resource, no equivalent of a Crossplane or of a Terraform data resource where you can search for something that may give 0 or more results. And the desire to say, like, one of the best things I think about playing infrastructure as code in a reconciliation loop is the ability to revert changes that were done manually by somebody clicking around. And that unless there's a way to say and no more, or simply no more, none at all, then like that doesn't, it's like in a way where a resource is its own resource, like I'm making a new role, I'm making a new policy, this isn't affecting anything else, then it's clear, like, yeah, that's just its own thing. But a resource like an attachment that is fundamentally a link between one resource and another resource is feels a bit more murky. Because so like, I don't know, the other idea that pops into my head is a way of having a role policy attachment resource that specifies a role and somehow doesn't specify, somehow instead of specifying a policy says no policies. And then that is the resource that's responsible for saying there should be nothing attached. But that still doesn't feel right. I don't know. Maybe the only way out of this paradox is to reverse the decision and say we can't support this at all. It's just sort of seems too bad because then we lose this great benefit of the reconciliation loop.
Yeah, so I also pasted a link, maybe folks have already seen it. But there's an issue for Crossplane, which asks for, adding support for queries, what you just described.
Right. So that's something that does not yet exist.
Yeah, and Matt, one solution could be like, to introduce, this has been discussed previously in the community. I cannot, pinpoint a specific discussion, but we could have composition functions, that do the query and, compose, the managed resources. Like, you could have a composition function that observes, let's say, using the Go SDK for AWS, and it queries a role and, discovers the management policies attached to it, and then composes a bunch of attachment objects, right? And, suddenly they become available for you, and, you can delete them to disassociate them. So that's kind of, currently, that's kind of how, I think we discussed this previously, but, this is how you would do it. Sticking to Crossplane's, like, best practices, let's say.
Then you need,
So I don't know.
you just need an
this
AWS
discussion,
SDK and the composition function.
yeah, maybe it's, if you read this discussion, maybe it's already mentioned here. I will do a quick search for
About the
composition
query?
functions, but yeah, but it doesn't mention composition functions. No, it mentions. So there's a comment from Hassan. I will also paste a direct link to it. I haven't read it. I don't know if it's saying what I'm saying, but it mentions composition functions.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it's
Uh,
describing something similar to what we discussed, I think.
So it sounds like you are leaning towards reversing the decision and removing support for this field.
Yeah, definitely. So we
Um,
cannot do it with 1.x releases. It would be a breaking change, certainly. But I would definitely go. So we also discussed this. I would definitely go for removing, those fields with 2.x.
So then the change that we could make in 1.x would be changing the documentation. Because the documentation currently explicitly says you can do this and it doesn't work.
Yeah, definitely. We need to fix the documentation.
And that I'm okay with that. I think there's it would be the related question as far as provider AWS is concerned is are there other cases like this and how many? I think I
Okay.
found a few related to resource policies on like a KMS key policy or an SNS topic policy. And I think some of them were, I remember what it was. I found I had a PR. That's why I had a PR to remove late init on a bunch of these, several of these other fields that had this same property. But I also found a few where we had the property existed. There was a Terraform resource for managing the policy. I don't think it was KMS, but I'm just going to use that as an example. So the KMS key had a policy field in its spec because it was in the Terraform schema. There was a Terraform key policy resource for managing the policy of a key. And Crossplane provider, our AWS provider, was skipping that key policy resource. Presumably because we made the key resource first, we had that policy, we didn't want to do a breaking change, say this is a separate resource, and saying this is now only managed here. It seems like a small problem in that case, in the case of a resource policy, because you can only have one. But I think if we're changing this decision, we should also figure out what to do about those cases, both the ones where there is both a field and a resource, and the ones where there is a field and a skipped resource.
Yeah, so I perceive this as an API quality issue. Like, the more we diverge from XRM, the less quality API we get, right? So the reference here is the XRM, to Crossplane resource model. So I would propose we open an issue where we collect, such violations that we discover. So when we are adding a new resource, basically we should be checking the level of conformance we have, the level of XRM conformance we have, right? So, when adding a new resource, there might be times that, we just overlook this fact that, we could have it, there's a separate, resource that we should be using instead of a field, embedded in another resource. So maybe it would help us, like, to collect such observations that we do. And, for the new resource additions, we should be careful about this, as we already know. but for the existing ones, we could consider like removing such fields with a major version bound so that we improve the quality of those APIs as I mentioned.
That sounds fine. I actually have to drop, but we're at time.
All right, Matt. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Next is, I believe Blake is still having problems. Marquez, if you would like to bring your case, you're listening. Welcome.
Hi, folks. Yeah, so the main problem that I wanted to talk about was the Upjet provider template repo. How I've been trying to follow along with it, but I don't get to follow along with it every step it takes along the way, and throughout the entire Upjet community. So it's hard to keep track of what current state is and what best practices are. So I may look at the source of like a Linode provider and see the changes that they've made and check the GCP and the AWS and the Azure and just sort of compare these things and compare them against the template to figure out what current state is. And so as I try to like update something from TerraJet to Upjet, there's a lot of things that aren't obvious, and there's not really a good source of documentation that shows this is the current state, or if you're going from this old version to this new version, these are the things that you need to migrate. So that one, that's a documentation problem. I think two is that the Upjet provider template repo has not been staying in sync with those best practices. There's PRs like over a year old that just tried to update to Crossplane Upjet from Upbound Upjet. I do see that change made it independent of some of those open PRs, but it's still lagging behind in the version. And because it's not tagged, because the template provider's not tagged, I can't say, let's look at, I last based my provider on V1. Let's see what happened on the road to V2 to V3. And so as a result of that, I get to my next problem, which is that with my particular provider, I've finally gotten it to a state where it's not dying because it can't find the Terraform workspace, and where it is executing Terraform with my provider in place. Although to do that, I had to revert some things, I think, back to the older practices of having the binary included in my image. So I've tried to remove the provider binary, as I see happening in the GCP and AWS. When I try to do that, I fall back to these, there's no Terraform workspace and other sorts of problems. So I don't have clear guidance on what to do in that case. Even when I compare provider to provider, I don't see what's missing. And my outstanding bug now that I would need to get past is this one about the IDs. So whenever I create new resources, it's attempting to observe the resource before the resource has attempted to be created. And so it says that it cannot find ID in state and in TF state, and it doesn't attempt to create it after that. There's another signal that I have about that, which is that one of my client APIs, my client SDK APIs, is allergic to people trying to do a request without a properly formatted UUID. And so when that request comes in, I get the hint that this must have been like an empty string attempt. It thought the ID was an empty string. It tried to make a request against that. The client SDK says that that's not a valid request. So I believe external name is being treated as an empty string being sent to observe, and it's never looping around. I think I saw somewhere a comment from you, Alper, somewhere that said that it's maybe common practice to put in like a bogus external name in some cases. I don't remember where I saw that. I think it was in sometime yesterday. I saw it in an AWS comment from probably a year ago. I don't know if that's what I should try to do here, but I didn't have to do that in the past. I didn't have to put in like annotations that weren't set with valid values. So those are the problems. And you can find me in SIG Upjet, where I've posted like the last 3 things and have been answering myself when things work well.
Yeah, thanks for bringing these in, Marquez. These are totally valid points, by the way. I wish John was here because he has been interested in bringing that repo up to date in the last few weeks. So I wish he was here, but maybe I am definitely going to let you know that, let him know that you're interested in these kinds of issues as well. So I see that our interests are aligned. Regarding concrete steps that we could take towards improving these points, well, I'm not sure at this point. Again, it's John's area of interest. But Alper, do you have any comments on these? So you have more experience than I have.
Yeah, so that's certainly an issue that, you know, we are aware of, like to update the template repo, update its dependencies. There has been a recent discussion, like, you know, whether we should be updating the template repo to the latest architecture, the network architecture, the architecture running the CLI binary, the binary. And so one question, were you, so my understanding is you're trying to switch from the CLI-based architecture to the Norfolk architecture, right?
That is just on the road to keeping the provider in sync, right? If I don't have to do that, I won't do that. If there's no benefit in doing it, then I don't necessarily have to do that. But when I'm trying to understand what current best practices or how to implement an Upjet provider, I'll see repos that still have evidence of doing it one way versus the other, or both, or a combination of ways. And so I think some of that might be dead code now. They may be building it with the CLI and then not actually using the CLI. My provider is an SDK and a framework provider, and I think that might be causing some of the problems. Like I have to jump to the latest version of Upjet to get, at least from the version I was at previously, to get support for framework. But in doing so, everything else is broken for my provider. Yeah.
You've got a couple of options there. You can choose CLI versus SDK versus framework on a per resource level. So if you want to only adopt the no-fork architecture for SDK resources, you can continue reconciling the framework resources with the CLI. And that, like, provider AWS did that for a while. The huge benefit of not using the CLI is that you don't have to fork a Terraform process for every reconciliation, and there was like 10 to 100x performance improvements at the provider level. So if that's important to you, then that's another reason to move forward aside from the abstract keeping up to date. I've seen some of this like empty string versus null missing external name stuff run into similar issues with that several times in provider AWS. It seems like my impression on it is that we are is that in the SDK resources, we are just defaulting to an empty string as using an empty string to represent there is no external name yet. And one of the major changes between the Terraform SDK and the Terraform plugin framework was more explicit support for null, and that includes in the ID. And at the Terraform layer, there is now, for framework resources, the ability to say this ID is actually null as a way of that's distinct from having it be the empty string. And but we haven't changed I haven't seen any changes on the crossplane, like the external name is still just always a string and it's not nullable. So this seems related, at least tangentially, to the fact that the identifier from provider external name config doesn't seem to work for any framework resources. I'm curious if you're seeing this kind get external name for framework resources, for SDK resources, or both.
I have a mix of other patterns going on. So we also updated the version of our client SDK that we were using to our API. So the errors that I get that report that it's an invalid UUID are different than they come from a handcrafted SDK versus a generated SDK that we have, where I don't get that same error. But I think I'm getting these errors in framework related resources. This was one of the things that I tried. I wanted to rule out myself. I wanted to see, are the plugin SDK based resources working fine? And I think my testing wasn't conclusive. I missed something. I think I also started with an already reconciling resource, and that was working all along, where it already had an external name set.
Right.
So I just thought, oh, this is working, but I didn't realize that it was a pre-existing resource.
It's a
So I
problem
need
that
to-
happens on creation.
Yeah. I think I did. I have a PR up where I'm trying to like meander my way through some possible updates I can make. I did notice the sort of, is this a string or is it null happening in some of these like set ID by name functions that you're using in the AWS provider. So I see the pattern that you're using there, and I could probably attempt that on these to see if I can detect if it was null.
Yeah, so one of the things, I don't know if you've already tried it. Did you try using identified from provider?
Yeah, I have
Which
ID from
could
provider
result
as the
in,
default.
unnormalized APIs, but it's the most stable one, let's say, identified from provider. And I think I understand what you are saying, like, in certain cases, there are some fake IDs that we provide because, otherwise, what Upjet does is to pass an empty string and, it breaks the underlying provider. In those cases, there's an artificial string. We should not really, correspond to an external resources real ID. You should make sure that in that case, like, what happens at the Terraform layer is, it tries to observe an external resource with that ID. It fails, returns a 404. And then you can continue with the create call following that. And at the end of the create call, you get, a valid ID, we store it, and then, we update the external name annotation, it takes you from there. So the idea is there. So you could give it a try. And, regarding the no-fork architecture and the CLI-based architecture, if it, it's okay to stay. So the no-fork architecture is a highly optimized one for performance reasons, but also, adopting to the no-fork architecture needs you to deal with the internals of the Terraform provider. So we are directly following the grid operations from the provider itself, and you need to use the external clients, SDK clients that provider needs, and you need to take care of those things. With this CLI-based architecture, you don't need to deal with those low-level issues, right? So, so what I'm trying to say is, as you probably already observed, it's easier to move on with the CLI-based one. It's the CLI-based external clients. But if you need those optimizations, then you can invest in, moving your provider to the new architecture. But the issues that you are describing, like, the Terraform layer complaining about malformed IDs and things like that, they are related to the external name configuration. And honestly speaking, external name configuration can become a quite complex topic. If you look at provider AWS, you will see crazy, external name configurations there. You need to figure out for your specific resources what works.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I saw in the AWS one that for a number of resources, they start with ID from provider and then they modify a few functions after that. And so I'll give that a shot. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Marquez. I put some pointers regarding external name configuration in plugin framework resources. Like Matt said, identifier from provider doesn't seem to be working because Terraform plugin framework has its own notion of empty IDs. So we have to tackle it at a higher level at some point, but you can look at the current configurations, custom configurations, and figure out if they work for you.
Hopefully the, fake ID approach works. We have seen it succeed in multiple cases.
Yep.
It really seems like it would be better to have the reconciler be smart enough to skip the query step when the external name is undefined.
At least in my provider, I'll take the cue from that Cognito user pool example where they do that exact check. But I guess to your point, you were saying upstream if it handled that.
Sounds good. So we have been over time for many times, for many minutes today. We had a busy agenda though. I hope to have busy agendas in future meetings so that I can manage them better. Thanks to everyone for joining, and I'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a good
you.
day.
Thanks everyone.